1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We've used that rhyme for so long that we forget its significance as the beginning of the era of global exploration and interaction. In the year 1492, Columbus demonstrated that the Earth is round, at a time when Europeans believed it was flat. 30 years after Columbus in 1522, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition successfully circumnavigated the entire globe, proving Columbus's theory about the shape and size of our planet. Ironically, Magellan himself never completed the voyage because he was killed by people of a different culture who felt threatened by his arrival. This experience was repeated throughout the post-Columbus era, whereby interactions between formerly isolated societies were often antagonistic and regularly savage. In most cases, arriving European powers overpowered and colonized societies with which they made contact. Later, once the United States became a global actor, the U.S. experience in the global world was similar to that of the European. The arrival of U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry in Japan was as contentious as any previous clash of the cultures. Yet Japan responded in very different ways to the arrival of a superior foreign force. Ultimately, Japan was the first society to successfully resist Western power and achieve an equal position in relation to the Western imperialist powers. However, Japan's rise began with a defeat at the hands of America's gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is a term that originated in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century era known as imperialism. This describes a strategy used mostly by the British and U.S. governments of utilizing superior naval and military technology to intimidate less powerful parts of the world. Gunboat diplomacy was intended to force previously isolated countries to grant concession to Western powers and engage in trade with the outside world. One of the best examples of gunboat diplomacy was the United States' opening of Japan by sending Matthew Perry and his black ships to coerce the Japanese kingdom into opening up and trading with America. To understand the significant impact Perry's gunboat diplomacy had on Japanese and world history, one needs to look at the medieval Japan before it had contact with the West. The Tokugawa Shogunate. The Tokugawa Shogunate was the last feudal government of medieval Japan. The years of the Tokugawa Shogunate were called the Edo period because they ruled from the Edo castle in what today the capital city of Japan, Tokyo. This period was similar to what Western history calls the medieval period. Medieval Japanese society was strictly ordered with the emperor at the top. His government was dominated by the shogun, which were like lords and were all a part of a clan named Tokugawa. Subservient to the shogun were the lesser lords known as daimyo. All feudal rulers in Japan ruled by the sword of their knights known as samurai. Below them were the peasants, followed by craftsmen and merchants in the lowest rank. In spite of this strict hierarchy, the shogun were in charge, while the emperor was but a powerless figurehead. The daimyo and samurai were also very similar, and sometimes samurai would act as local lords, while daimyo could be trained as samurai. This social structure was generally not disturbed, except in some conflicts caused by taxation. Since peasants were taxed at a fixed amount, their tax revenue became worth less over time. This led to financial difficulty for the daimyo and samurai classes, occasionally causing them both small local disturbances and much bigger rebellions. But no peasants were strong enough to really challenge the shogunate until foreign powers had arrived, which led to a complete restructuring of Japan's society. The Perry Expedition. Matthew C. Perry was born into a family of sailors, so naturally he pursued a career in the United States Navy. He fought in many battles and had won many medals. The Navy eventually gave him the rank of Commodore. In 1853, the United States of America dispatched Commodore Perry to sail ships on a diplomatic mission to Japan. His mission was to open up Japan to trade and to end Japan's policy of isolationism. America also wanted to use Japan as a base for steamships to restock coal. Perry brought 4 ships with him. 2 of the ships were steam-powered and employed with the intention of scaring and coercing the Japanese government. The ships were armed heavily as well. When Perry's armada arrived in Edo on July 8, 1853, the Tokugawa Shogunate didn't want anything to do with the Americans. The Japanese tried to make the Americans leave, but in a show of force, Perry had his boat steam towards Edo and turn their guns toward the shore, firing blank rounds from his 73 state-of-the-art Pax-Hands cannons. Perry claimed he was firing the cannon in celebration of America's Independence Day. Once he finally succeeded in delivering his letter to the emperor, Perry left, but promised he would be back in 1 year. However, America soon heard the Russians were also trying to establish relations with the Japanese, so Perry returned ahead of schedule on February 13, 1854. This time he brought 7 ships, 4 of which were steam-powered. The Japanese were so impressed with his prior demonstration of American naval technology and firepower that they decided to meet and negotiate a treaty. This task was long and tedious, for everything they said needed to be translated. Once the Japanese reluctantly met all Perry's requirements, he invited them to his ship for a feast. He bestowed upon them many gifts such as guns, perfumes, and a telegraph. On March 31, 1854, the Treaty of Kanawha was signed. Now there was peace and friendship between America and Japan. Japan agreed to supply and assist U.S. ships in the area, and America gave Japan some steamships and guns. Few would have guessed at the time that Japan's concession to Perry's threat would be the first step in Japan becoming a world power. In fact, it was this exchange which led directly to Japan's Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration. Meiji in Japanese is Meiji. Mei means enlightened and Ji means rule, so the Meiji meant enlightened rule. The word restoration referred to restoring the emperor to the position of ultimate authority. In fact, the Meiji Restoration was a chain of events that brought Japan out of its medieval past and into the modern world. Before the Meiji Restoration, it was mostly the daimyo who controlled everything. However, Japan knew it was far behind the Western powers, and the daimyo quickly fell in line beneath the emperor. In fact, the Meiji Emperor faced only 2 battles of resistance, and once he won those, the Tokugawa shogunate came to an official ending on November 9, 1867. Although he had absolute authority, the Meiji Emperor continued to rule primarily as a spiritual authority. He left the work of modernization to a group of prominent Japanese intellectuals and oligarchs who took decisive steps to make reforms that would allow Japan to catch up with Western powers. As part of their policies for civilization and enlightenment, the Meiji leaders accelerated industrialization, which led to a rise in military power. They did this under the banner cry, Fukoku Kyohei, meaning enrich the country, strengthen the military. Land reform was also carried out to abolish the old social classes of shogun, daimyo, samurai, and peasants. All Tokugawa lands were seized and turned into prefectures of the Meiji. In exchange, former daimyos were promised payments of 1/10 of their former fiefs from the Meiji government. The samurai were also abolished. Many samurai were assigned to roles as police officers, government officials, teachers, military officers, or traditional artisans. However, former samurai were prohibited from wearing their traditional swords in public places. To strengthen the military, all young men on their 21st birthday were required to serve for 4 years in the imperial army. This kind of conscription allowed Japan to quickly assemble a large and well-trained army. A massive increase in industries such as shipyards, iron smelting, and spinning mills allowed Japan to have supplies of the tools it needed for modernization. As Japan acquired steamships and railroads, it developed a need for coal, which was only one of the many natural resources Japan would need to import from other countries. In 1889, Japan adopted the constitution called the Meiji Constitution. In 1890, under the Meiji, Japan established its first parliament called the Diet and extended voting rights to all men in 1925. As with Western powers, democratization allowed for the further development of economy and society. As a result of the Meiji reforms, Japan quickly evolved into a major power with military and industrial strength that drove imperial ambitions which paralleled those of the Western powers. Inevitably, it would also be these ambitions that brought Japan into conflict with the United States, the country whose gunboat diplomacy had provoked Japan into achieving equal status in international affairs. Commodore Matthew Perry's opening of Japan ultimately led to Japan's opening and modernization, yet it also led to Japan's warmongering in the 20th century. If World War II can be seen as a long-term impact of the Meiji Restoration, then perhaps Japan's 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor can be seen as kind of a revenge for Commodore Perry's threats to Japan in Edo Harbor in 1853. Fortunately, the outcome of World War II has been a strong and enduring friendship between the United States and Japan. Under this friendship, Japan has evolved into the most technologically advanced country in the world. Did Perry's expedition lead to all of this? I think so.